Yeah, we've been studying the history of the kings of the divided kingdom of Israel and Judah. And last time we went through the sequence of kings who ruled after Solomon. And we saw that the last prominent characters were Ahab, the wicked king in the north, and there was also Jehoshaphat, the godly king in the southern kingdom of Judah. So these two were contemporaries. Okay. Their children, both their children were wicked and weak, incompetent and weak kings. And this was the time of Elisha's ministry. Before that, there was Elijah. And today we're going to pick up the story when Ahab's son, Joram, is ruling in the north. So remember, Ahab was the wicked king, and his son Joram, who is also wicked, is ruling in the north. And in the south, we have Jehoshaphat's grandson, whose name is Ahaziah, and he also happens to be the northern king's nephew. Okay, he's ruling in the south. And these two were allied with each other. Both of them had recently gone to a town in the northeastern border of Israel called Ramoth Gilead. And the reason was to defend it against the Syrians. Remember, Syria is to the northeast of Israel, and the Syrians were attacking from that side. And so these two kings were allied, and they went there to defend the city against the Syrians. So in the battle, Joram was badly injured, and he left the garrison there, and he returned to Jezreel. And Jezreel was his holiday home. Remember that in the northern kingdom, the capital was Samaria, but the summer home or the holiday home of the royal family was in a beautiful place called Jezreel Valley. So that's where Joram went to recover from the wounds that the Syrians had given him. His nephew Ahaziah, the king of Judah, went back to Jerusalem. But then soon after that, Ahaziah came from Jerusalem to Jezreel to check on his uncle. How is my uncle recovering from his wounds? Okay, so that is the situation. So when these two kings, one king is sick, the senior one, the junior one is his nephew. He has come from Judah to check on his uncle. In that situation, when the army is still in Ramoth Gilead, in that situation, the story progresses further. Shall we read 2 Kings chapter 9 and verse 1? 2 Kings chapter 9, verse 1. And Elisha the prophet called one of the children of the prophets and said unto him, Gird up thy loins and take this box of oil in thine hand and go to Ramoth Gilead. Okay, so that's what the prophet does. He goes to Ramoth Gilead. Verse 5. And when he came, behold, the captains of the army were sitting. And he said, I have an errand to thee, O captain. And Jehu said, Unto which of all of us? And he said, To thee, O captain. And he arose and went into the house, and he poured the oil on his head, and said to him, Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, I have anointed thee king over the people of the Lord, even over Israel. And you shall smite the house of Ahab, thy master, that I may avenge the blood of my servants the prophets, and the blood of all the servants of the Lord at the hand of Jezebel. Okay, so this is the mission that Elisha gave to one of the junior prophets. Go all the way to Ramoth Gilead and anoint this person called Jehu. Now, God had taken the name of Jehu first while speaking to Elijah, who was Elisha's predecessor. So at that time, many years back, Elijah was very disappointed, very upset, because of all the evil that Ahab and Jezebel were doing. So they had introduced Baal worship, the worship of the Canaanite god Baal, into the land of Israel, and they were persecuting people who would want to worship the true God. So they were doing a lot of evil. Elijah was very unhappy. And at that time, God told Elijah that Jehu is going to be anointed, and he is going to execute judgment on the house of Ahab. So we find my point here is that the announcement that God made was long back, but now comes the time, several years, perhaps more than a couple of decades later, comes the time for fulfilling this. The lesson here is that the judgment of God will surely come, although sometimes it takes a long time to come. When somebody does evil, if we are hurt by that evil, then we will want God to judge that person immediately. But God has his timings. When God says judgment will come, it will surely come, but it will come in his timing. So eventually, God's decrees are always fulfilled. Now, if you look at Jehu's reaction here, Jehu does not express any surprise. We have some examples in the Bible when God gives them a mission. Then they say, who am I that I should do it? I can't do this thing. I'm a child, or I cannot speak properly. And Jehu does not give any of those kind of excuses, or he does not have those reservations. So we come to know from here, Jehu was a confident person, and he also disapproved of Ahab's activities. He was also unhappy at what the royal family was up to, and he wanted judgment to come on Ahab's family. And when he heard that he is going to be God's instrument for doing so, he was up to the task. It is interesting to see the first mention in the Bible of somebody, or the first glimpse of somebody. So many army captains were sitting there, and the prophet came there. It is Jehu who speaks first to the prophet. And as we go along, we will see that that is a good indication of his personality. He is the go-getter. He is the person who is quick to act, and he acts drastically. Right? So he is quite confident to do what the prophet has asked him to do. His colleagues, they asked him what happened, and he told his colleagues what the prophet had said. In verse 13, I'm reading, they hasted, took every man his garment, and put it under him on the top of the stairs, and blew with trumpets, saying, Jehu is king. The moment they came to know that this fellow has been anointed as king, immediately they make a makeshift throne for him with their own clothes. They make him sit there and they blow the trumpet. In other words, they declare their allegiance to the new king. If you read these verses, they had referred to that young prophet as a madman. When they first asked Jehu, what happened? What did he say? They called him a madman. So they didn't take him seriously. But now when Jehu told them, they take it very seriously. Now, it is a very major thing for one king, for somebody to be proclaimed king when another king already is ruling. When there's a functional king, if you have a new king coming, then you cannot have two kings coexisting, right? So one king and his supporters have to die. This is a very major thing when somebody tries to usurp the throne. And yet, these soldiers have absolutely no problems in immediately proclaiming their allegiance to Jehu. And I was trying to wonder, like, why was that? And it seems like Joram was a weak king. He was weak, he was wicked, and he was unpopular. And the army was glad to put their hat, or take off their hats to Jehu. There's also, I believe, another factor that is relevant here. Elisha had done so many miracles, and even Elijah before him. The population of Israel knew that when Elisha says something, it is going to happen. Okay, we have not gone through all the incidents in the life of Elisha, but if you read the previous chapters, you will find that there were some occasions when Elisha rescued Joram from the Syrians. So there's a lot of involvement of Elisha. The army knew it. If Elisha says it, the word of the Lord is with him. So if Elisha has appointed Jehu as king, that comes from God, we might as well go with it. So Jehu immediately got the support of the army when he was proclaimed as king. So now Jehu has to act. He immediately requests the army not to send any word to Jezreel about what has happened. He immediately requests them, let not any word go there. and he instead starts moving towards Jezreel along with a contingent. Let us read verse 17 and 18. As he is approaching Jezreel, there stood a watchman on the tower in Jezreel, and he spied the company of Jehu as he came and said, I see a company. And King Joram said, take a horseman and send it to meet him, and let him say, is it peace? So they went one on horseback to meet him and said, thus says the king, is it peace? And Jehu said, what hast thou to do with peace? Turn thee behind me. And the watchman informed, saying, the messenger came to them, but he does not return. Okay, so I guess the situation is clear to everyone. There is a hilltop overlooking the valley of Jezreel. There are many mountains nearby. And the watchman is looking. He sees Jehu coming in his chariot along with a few other army people. And he sends sends a messenger to Jehu asking if he is coming in peace. But Jehu just asked the messenger, what do you have to do with peace? Just turn behind me and come along with me. So Joram then decides to send a second messenger. And the same thing happens. Jehu again tells the second messenger, you come behind me. So Joram now realizes that something is not right. In verse 20, after the second messenger does not return, the watchman said, verse 20, the watchman said, saying, he came even unto them and comes not again. And the driving is like the driving of Jehu, the son of Nimshi, for he drives furiously. Okay, I'm smiling because I know that I also have that kind of reputation out here, right? But the watchman could now identify Jehu from the way he was driving his chariot. And since two messengers are not returning, Joram decided that perhaps it is needful for him to go and meet him. And as I said, Ahaziah, the king of Judah, had also come. So both of them, the two kings of the south and the north, go to meet Jehu, who is approaching Jezreel. Now, here in these verses, we get a glimpse into the personality of Jehu. He is shrewd, you can see. He has a plan of action. He knows that it is best not to allow the news of the anointing to spread. It is better to catch the king in his surprise. The king is already sick and wounded. It's better to catch him by surprise. And he knows how to handle people. He doesn't tell the messenger exactly what he's up to. He just says, you just turn behind me and what's there? You just come. So he knows how to handle people. He is aggressive. We see that from the way he is riding his chariot. And as we will see in the following verses, he is also a skilled warrior. He has got a good aim. He is very good with his chariot and his bow and his arrow. So the two kings go out to meet him. Let us read verse 21. 2 Kings chapter 9, verse 21. And Joram said, make ready. And his chariot was made ready. And Joram, king of Israel, and Ahaziah, king of Judah, went out, each in his chariot, and they went out against Jehu, and met him in the portion of Naboth the Jezreelite. And it came to pass, when Joram saw Jehu, that he said, is it peace, Jehu? And he answered, what peace, so long as the whoredoms of thy mother Jezebel and her witchcraft are so many? And Joram turned his hands and fled, and said to Ahaziah, there is treachery, O Ahaziah. So here Jehu mentions whoredom and witchcraft on the part of Jezebel. Remember, Jezebel was the mother of Joram and the wife of Ahab. Now, whoredom is probably applied here both literally and figuratively. Jezebel had introduced Baal worship into Israel. And Jehu must have recognized this as spiritual adultery against Jehovah. People of Israel were supposed to worship Jehovah, the true God, and instead they had left him and they were worshiping Baal. So in a spiritual sense, this is adultery. But it is also true that Baal worship was accompanied by sexual immorality. There were, sexual rituals involved. And so no doubt Jezebel was involved in these things, or she might have instigated other people to be involved. So both in a literal and figurative sense, there was whoredom. And he also mentions witchcraft. So the idol worship or the Canaanite religion was accompanied by the attempts to contact evil spirits. And Jehu knew that this goes against the laws that God had given the people of Israel. So Jehu mentions these things and he says, you people are doing the wrong thing. And so how can there be peace? How can I come in peace? So Joram understands that Jehu is conspiring against him. And so Joram turns around and tries to flee. But it says in the following verses that Jehu drew out his bow and arrow, and he fired an arrow, and he managed to hit Joram. So Joram died in his chariot. Okay. Now, look at verse 25. Then said Jehu to Bidkar his captain, saying, take him and throw him in the field of Naboth the Jezreelite. For remember how, when you and I rode together after Ahab his father, the Lord laid this burden upon him. Surely I have seen yesterday the blood of Naboth and the blood of his sons, says the Lord, and I will requite you in this plot, says the Lord. So here we understand that Jehu was also an officer under Ahab. And Jehu knew when God had pronounced judgment against Ahab. Remember, Ahab had murdered Naboth just because he wanted that plot of land, which was Naboth's ancestral property. So Ahab got Naboth murdered, and God had pronounced judgment. Now you might ask, why is the judgment falling in Joram? Okay, remember, Ahab is the one who killed Naboth. Why is the judgment falling on his son? The reason is that Ahab had repented. Ahab showed some repentance, but evidently Joram was of the same mindset as Ahab and his wife. Jezebel was the one who schemed and killed Naboth. Joram was of the same mind as Jezebel, and that's why the judgment fell on Joram, and he died right on the ancestral property of the victim, of his murder victim. Okay, so here in verse 21, we noted that these kings met Jehu at the property of Naboth. So here again, you see the sovereignty or the providence of God. It happened that Jehu confronted Joram right at the property of Naboth, where God had said, I will inflict judgment on the house of Ahab. So, of course, Ahab also had a violent death. Ahab also got injured in battle and he bled to death. But still, Ahab was specifically spared the judgment for Naboth because it was his wife who instigated him, and he also showed some repentance. But here Joram gets that judgment. And then if you read further, Jehu also kills Ahaziah, the king of Judah. But one difference is there. Ahaziah gets a decent burial. His servants carried him to Jerusalem, and he was buried at the royal sepulchre there. So far we have seen Jehu is anointed as king, and Jehu kills Joram, the northern king of Israel, and Jehu also kills Ahaziah, who is aligned with Joram. But Ahaziah's body is taken back to Jerusalem and given a decent burial, whereas Joram is eaten by dogs on the property of Naboth. Then let us read verse 30. 2 Kings chapter 9, verse 30 and 31. And when Jehu came into Jezreel, Jezebel heard of it, and she painted her face and decorated her head, made up her head, and looked out from a window. And as Jehu entered in at the gate, she said, had Zimri peace, who slew his master. And here you understand, this is the woman Jezebel. She is the one who has brought in this idol worship into Israel. She is the epicenter of the evil that has been plaguing this land. And we see here that she is so full of herself. She refused to acknowledge that judgment is on its way. There must have been a few hours gap before Joram's death and Jehu reaching the palace here, because Jehu took some time to pursue after the king of Judah. So in those few hours, no doubt the news had spread, and Jezebel was aware that Joram had been killed. And so she compares Jehu to an earlier character called Zimri. Now, Zimri had killed his master, that is the king, just because he wanted to usurp the throne. He had not been appointed anything by God, just because he wanted to usurp the throne. But Jezebel takes his name. Now here you see she's making up her face. This was probably her routine, and it was so important to her. And the turn of events was so unimportant. She was going about her usual routine. She cannot believe that God's judgment is on its way. And we also see that she was never bothered about ethics when she was scheming against Naboth. She was never bothered about ethics. But now she is almost preaching to Jehu, saying that, do you remember Zimri? You are like Zimri. Okay, but this is a character of people of the world. When it suits them, they will bring up ethics, or they will talk about moral cause and effect, but otherwise they will not bother about it. But what does Jehu react? Verse 32. And he lifted up his face to the window and said, who is on my side? And they looked out to him 2 or 3 eunuchs. And he said, throw her down. So they threw her down, and some of her blood was sprinkled on the wall and on the horses, and he trod her underfoot. So Jezebel died a violent death. Jehu is not the man who is going to give her a proper answer. He himself is full of himself. He is arrogant. He is aggressive, and he is not going to engage with her. He just wants her dead, and that is what he accomplishes. Jehu had the sense to know that surely everyone wouldn't have liked Jezebel. Surely there would be someone in the palace who doesn't like her, because she was a wicked lady after all. And so he trampled her. And then after having killed his masters, Jehu goes inside the palace. He helps himself to some food. He gets his new servants to feed him. And then he goes and he tells them, okay, you bury that Jezebel, because after all, she is a king's daughter. Since she is of royal birth, let us at least do the decency of giving her a burial. So the servants go out to check her body. Verse 36. Then they returned back and told him that dogs had eaten her body. And he said, this is the word of the Lord, which he spoke by his servant Elijah the Tishbite, saying, in the portion of Jezreel shall dogs eat the flesh of Jezebel. So the moment she was trampled underfoot, dogs came, they ate up her body. So she also did not get a decent burial. But just as she had spilled the blood of so many people, her blood was spilled in Jezreel. And she literally went without anybody missing her. That's the legacy of an evil person. And Jehu remembers what Elijah has spoken. So from here, we again come to know that Jehu has some spirituality. He has some knowledge of God. He knows that Elijah is his prophet, and he knows that what the prophet says will come to pass. If you remember, Jezebel had told Elijah that, may the gods do anything to me if I do not kill you by this time tomorrow. So the worst possible judgment she heaped on herself if she does not kill Elijah. Of course, God delivered Elijah. Elijah ran away. But now that kind of violent death came to her. What she had done to the prophets, what she had done to so many righteous people came to her. Now, Jezreel was the holiday home of Ahab's family. And Jehu has just killed the king and the queen mother there. but the official capital of the kingdom was at Samaria. So that's where Ahab's children were. Ahab had 70 sons, and they were all being tutored in Samaria. So Jehu wrote a letter to the tutors of Ahab's sons. Let us read chapter 10, verse 2. Now, as soon as this letter comes to you, seeing that your master's sons are with you, and there are also with you chariots, horses, a fenced city also, and armor, choose the best of your master's sons, set him on his father's throne, and fight for your master's house. So Jehu invites them, okay, I've killed the king. You have the king's sons with you. So please put somebody else on the throne and fight for your master's house. But the tutors, the officials who were tutoring the children of Ahab, they thought that Jehu is too much to handle. They were frightened, and they told Jehu, we are willing to submit to you. We don't want to fight against you. We are willing to accept you as king. Okay. So then Jehu quickly wrote back to them, is it so? Okay, then by tomorrow, just send me all these people's heads. Cut off their heads and send me all their heads to Jezreel tomorrow. And that's what the tutors did. Verse 8. And there came a messenger and told him, saying, they have brought the heads of the king's sons. And he said, lay them in 2 heaps at the entering in of the gate until the morning. So he wanted the population of the city to see that Ahab's dynasty has come to an end. Now it is in your interest to be subservient to the new king. That's the message that Jehu is giving to the population. And then verse 9, it came to pass in the morning that he went out and stood and said to all the people, you are righteous, or you are innocent. Behold, I conspired against my master and slew him. But who slew all these people? Okay, so Jehu is telling the people, don't worry, you all are innocent. A lot of stuff has happened, but you people are innocent. Okay, I conspired against my master and killed him. But who killed all these people? I don't know. Stuff is happening. God is making things happen. Jehu does not want to tell the population that he is the mastermind behind all this killing. He's trying to make it look as if, things are happening beyond my control also, bigger than me also. And in verse 10, he says, know now that nothing shall fail of the word of the Lord, which the Lord spake concerning the house of Ahab through the prophet Elijah. So we do see that Jehu is indulging a little bit of manipulation. He's trying to make it look as if, he is not responsible for all this killing. And he also wants to make the people know that what is happening is because of what God had promised Elijah, the judgment against the house of Ahab. If he was completely surrendered to the will of God, then what Jehu would have done is that he would have held something like a court where he listed down the things that these people have done. And then he would have said, see, according to the law that God gave Moses, such people have to die. And therefore, I am putting them to death. That is what Jehu would have done if he wanted to do things in the proper godly way. But, he chose this method, deceit, craft, and cleverness. And manipulation of people. That was Jehu's style of functioning. And we are not reading all the verses, but if you read further, there are some relatives of Ahaziah, the king of Judah. They don't know everything that has happened. All they know is that Joram was sick and Ahaziah had come to visit him. So they come innocently to Samaria, and Jehu finds them, and Jehu kills all of them. They are Ahaziah's people, not Joram's people. Of course, the two families were related by marriage. So in an extended sense, they are also part of Ahab's family. But Jehu has no time to waste or no regard for anybody. He kills them as well. Then let us come down to chapter 10, verse 15. Chapter 10, verse 15. When he left from there, he lighted on Jehonadab, the son of Rechab, coming to meet him, and he saluted him and said to him, Is thine heart right, as my heart is with thy heart? And Jehonadab answered, It is. If it be, give me thine hand. And he gave him his hand, and he took him up to him into the chariot. And he said, Come with me and see my zeal for the Lord. Come with me and see my zeal for the Lord. Now, Rechab was a foreigner who had migrated to Israel. And Jehonadab was one of the leaders of the community. And these were evidently godly people. They had come from outside Israel and made themselves part of the house of Israel because they had realized that Jehovah, the God of Israel, is a true God. So they had come to the land, although they were not natives. And they were obviously not happy with all the idolatry that Ahab has introduced. So Jehu is now trying to impress this man, who is probably genuinely a spiritual man. He's trying to impress him, saying that, Come and see my zeal for the Lord. So what does Jehu do to show his zeal for the Lord? In verse 17, he just goes and kills a lot of people. People who had some connection to Ahab. When you see the way Jehu is killing people, it seems as if is it really love for the Lord? Is it really zeal for the Lord, or is it zeal for his throne? Since Ahab was the former king, anybody who has some connection to Ahab is a potential rival, isn't it? And Jehu wants to eliminate every possible threat to the throne. So perhaps more than zeal for the Lord, it is zeal for his own throne. And we also should ask ourselves the same question. When we do stuff, we do activities in the church, is it really zeal for the Lord, or is it zeal for ourselves and the regard and the respect that we get from others, or the popularity, or the opportunity to make ourselves known, the opportunity to meet new people? Is it zeal for all that motivates us to do Christian activities, or is it really zeal for the Lord? So these two were shortchanged in Jehu's life. Now read verse 18, chapter 10, verse 18. And Jehu gathered all the people together and said unto them, Ahab served Baal a little, but Jehu shall serve him much. Look at what he's saying. Ahab and Jezebel were the pioneers of Baal worship in the land. So they were devotees of Baal. In fact, Jezebel was the daughter of a priest. It's not written in the Bible, but it's there in history. She was the daughter of a priest who became the king of Sidon. And so she was very devoted to Baal worship, she and her husband. And Jehu is now saying that I'm going to serve Baal much more than these people did. Okay. Now, this was actually a trick. So Jehu was again doing some scheme here. So what he did is he proclaimed a festival, a feast for Baal, and he got all the worshippers of Baal to the shrine of Baal, and he had a full-scale worship celebration there. He asked his servants to check and see and make sure that no worshipper of Jehovah is present there. Only the worshippers of Baal are present. And then he had his soldiers outside the shrine. And look at verse 25, chapter 10, verse 25. It came to pass, as soon as he had made an end of offering the burnt offering, that Jehu said to the guard and to the captains, Go in and slay them, let none come forth. And they smote them with the edge of the sword, and the guard and the captains cast them out, and went to the city of the house of Baal, and they brought forth the images out of the house of Baal and burned them. And they destroyed the temple of Baal as well. Now here you see that Jehu knew what was right and wrong. Okay, but he did not perceive that God's work has to be done in God's ways. And we are prone to making the same mistake, right? The common example given is like, suppose we were having some open air meetings and outdoor meetings in some remote place, and we need electricity. Then suppose we were to take electricity from the transmission cables that were passing through that place. That is trying to do God's work, but not in God's ways. Deception is not God's way, but that is the way that Jehu chose. As I said earlier, the right way to do this would have been to proclaim that our nation has been doing wrong. We have been brought from Egypt to this land, a land that God has given to us. We have been brought here by Jehovah, and we have entered into a covenant with him to worship him alone. So if these people are worshiping Baal, they need to die, because that is the covenant that we have brought ourselves into with Jehovah. And then he was supposed to execute all the people, but instead he chose stealth and deception and trickery. So this is how Baal worship ended, at least in the northern kingdom. It would be another 7 years before it would end in the southern kingdom. But Jehu managed to get Baal worship out of the land. It all began when Ahab married Jezebel. And you might feel like asking, why did God allow this kind of marriage? So much of problem came into Israel just because Ahab married this Sidonian princess. But God, when we see this history, and we see the present also, God gives a lot of free will to people. He does not stop people from doing wrong things many times. And some of those wrong choices have horrible consequences. We may not like that, but that is God's way, that sometimes he allows people to do wrong choices, and he allows painful consequences to come. But he also brings judgment. Okay, actually, a lot is at stake here. Remember, Israel was God's chosen people. It is through Israel that the Messiah was supposed to come. If the whole country becomes worshippers of Baal, then how will Jesus have his 12 disciples? How will the Lord have a community of Jewish believers who can spread the gospel to the other parts of the earth if the whole country is given over to Baal worship? So unknown to Jezebel, she may have not realized it, but she was actually working to jeopardize God's plans for the whole world. Okay. So God does not stop Ahab from marrying Jezebel, but God will not allow his eternal purposes for the world to be thwarted. So there you see there is a boundary for evil. Based on free will, God may allow evil to continue up to a point, but God will stop that evil and prevent that evil from thwarting his eternal purposes. So thank God that he did not leave our eternal destiny in the hands of Jezebel, but he took action, and Jehu was his instrument. The Bible has a little bit more to say about Jehu. Shall we read verse 30? 2 Kings chapter 10, verse 30. And the Lord said unto Jehu, because you have done well in executing that which is right in my eyes, and has done unto the house of Ahab according to all that was in my heart, thy children of the 4th generation shall sit on the throne of Israel. So here we see that God indeed wanted to judge the house of Ahab. It's not that, Jehu killed people that killed Ahab's children, which God did not want to be killed or something like that. God wanted that judgment to be executed on the house of Ahab. So accordingly, God blessed and rewarded Jehu for what he did. Now, 4 generations on the throne was the longest for any other dynasty that ruled the northern kingdom. This northern kingdom was chaotic. One person would rule, then his son would come, and then there would be a usurper who assassinates his son and takes over the throne. So in that way, Jehu had the privilege of founding the longest royal dynasty in the land of Israel. Okay. At the same time, turn for a moment the previous page, 2 Kings chapter 10, verse 11. It says, Jehu slew all that remained of the house of Ahab, all his great men, and all his kinsfolks. Now, kinsfolks literally means friends or acquaintances. Great men probably means his officials. So now look at what is happening here. If you were a senior official in Ahab's administration, you would get killed by Jehu. You may not approve of everything that Ahab does. You may not be an idolater by like Ahab is, but in his enthusiasm, Jehu killed them. You may know Ahab personally. Now, is it your fault if you know Ahab personally? Jehu killed even Ahab's acquaintances. So here we see that Jehu seems to have gone overboard. Yeah, it is true that God wanted judgment to fall on the house of Ahab. But Jehu not only killed the house of Ahab, he killed many others. And we can be sure that his sons were watching what their father did, killing people indiscriminately. And later on, his sons would come to the throne, and they evidently continued this practice. Jehu had a mandate, a divine mandate to kill Ahab's household, but he did not have a divine mandate to kill other people just because they know Ahab or just because they were part of his administration. But his sons saw him act like this, and they also evidently acted like that. Now, why do I say that? If you read, let's read one verse from Hosea. Hosea was a prophet who lived a couple of generations after Jehu. And in Hosea chapter 1, verse 4, Hosea chapter 1, verse 4, it says like this: the Lord said unto him, that is Hosea, call his name Jezreel, for yet a little while, and I will avenge the blood of Jezreel upon the house of Jehu. So Jezreel was the city where Jehu had done a lot of killing. And it says, I will avenge their blood on the house, on the family, on the dynasty of Jehu. So Jehu killed people unnecessarily, and evidently his sons also did so. So while he was right in killing the real villains, he also went further. So he was rash in that sense. Okay, then let's read verse 31. Come back to 2 Kings chapter 10, verse 31. But Jehu took no heed to walk in the law of the Lord God of Israel with all his heart, for he departed not from the sins of Jeroboam, which made Israel to sin. Now, what was the sin of Jeroboam? Jeroboam made shrines in Israel, altars in Israel, in which a golden calf was worshipped. It was some sort of syncretic religion, a mix of worship of Jehovah and some sort of idol. The reason Jeroboam did that is because he did not want people to go to Jerusalem to worship, because he thought that his throne would not be secure if his subjects went to the southern kingdom to worship. So Jehu allowed this status quo to continue. You remember he told that Jehonadab earlier, come and see my zeal for the Lord. But here you see zeal for his own chair, his own throne. If you're so zealous for the Lord, then why don't you encourage your population to go to Jerusalem and worship at the true center that God had established? The true place of worship was Jerusalem. Why do you encourage them to worship golden calves in your own kingdom? Right? So Jehu allowed the status quo to continue just because he was concerned about holding on to his throne. So, it happens that many people, we know that God is true, but the response in our lives to that knowledge is not adequate. Jehu was not a worshiper of Baal. He was not an atheist either. He knew that Jehovah is the true God. Okay, so if Jehovah is the true God, then does he not deserve our complete devotion? Does he not deserve our allegiance? Does he not deserve our complete obedience then? But Jehu refused to give him. He obeyed him in one area, but he did not obey him in other areas. Now we saw Jehu quoting Elijah. And we also learned that it was a messenger, a prophet from Elisha, one of Elisha's students, who anointed Jehu as king. So Jehu knew about Elijah, he knew about Elisha. No doubt he also knew about the various junior prophets that Elisha was training up. But we have no record of Jehu taking any counsel from them, interacting with them, taking their help in any way. I have become a king. God has made me a king. I need spiritual guidance. I need to be a spiritual person to lead this people. I need people to mentor me. Elisha, you are a senior person. You also were associated with Elijah, who was also a man of God. Could you teach me something of God's ways? Could you be with me and guide me as to how I should rule this people? Jehu had absolutely no place for any of these things. And we ought to ask ourselves, are we just living lives according to our own abilities and our own confidence? Jehu was a very confident person. He's an aggressive person, very competent, very skilled, aggressive, outgoing person. And he has so much of self-confidence, doesn't see any reason to seek God's help for doing the right thing. And that's a lesson for us also. But we also learn from here that God can use an unspiritual man as well. God is not limited to using godly people. Sometimes God can even use carnal people or worldly people in order to accomplish his purposes. That's a lesson that we learn from here. Then let's read verse 33 and 34. 32 and 33. 2 Kings chapter 10, verse 32. In those days, the Lord began to cut Israel short, and Hazael smote them in all the coasts of Israel. From Jordan eastward, all the land of Gilead, the Gadites, the Reubenites, the Manassites, from Aroer, which is by the river, Arnon, even Gilead and Bashan. Now, there is a person called Hazael mentioned here. Just as Jehu had usurped his master's throne and changed the dynasty, ruling dynasty in Israel, something similar had happened in Syria. And in fact, Elisha was the one who predicted that Hazael would come to the throne. So Hazael also assassinated his master, the existing king of Syria, and he took over. And now we see that just as Jehu is a go-getter, so is Hazael. He was the new king of Syria, again, very powerful, aggressive, confident. And we find here that for all the bravado that Jehu had shown in Jezreel and in Samaria, killing his own people, he couldn't stand up to the Syrians. As we know, the people of Israel had territory on the west of Jordan River and also to the east. There were three tribes, Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh, who were living on the eastern side of the Jordan. And that was the first point of attack for the Syrians. So we see here that Jehu lost a lot of territory, lost a lot of his subjects because of the attacks from the Syrians. So very aggressive personality, throwing his weight around, but did not have any victories against Israel's enemies, against the external enemies of God's people. And that is also a challenge for us, isn't it? Sometimes we can pick up fights with our own people, but can you stand for the truth of the gospel in the face of attacks from outsiders who are really hostile? Jehu was not able to do that. If human ability and aggression and self-confidence, if these are our forte, then we must be aware that there are other self-confident people also out there. If you and I are skilled, be aware that there are other skilled people, perhaps better skilled than us. To really do great things, God's help is needed. David was also a skilled man. If I compare Jehu with David, David was also very skilled. He was a tough person, a warrior, extremely good at what he did. But David also relied on and trusted God. And because of that, David was able to do great exploits. He had a skill, but he relied on God, and God helped him. And God really accomplished great things through the life of David. By the way, David defeated the Syrians in one of the battles. But Jehu was not able to do so. So here you have a man Self-confidence and skill is his asset. He acknowledges the true God, but there is no real godliness, no depth of godliness, no humility, no commitment to honor God to the best of one's ability in all possible areas. Nobody is perfect. But Jehu was the king. If he wanted, he could have encouraged the people, stop worshipping golden calves here. Go to Jerusalem. Let us go to Jerusalem and let us worship the true God. He could have encouraged his people that way, but he didn't. So that was the story of Jehu, a man that God used, an instrument to execute judgment on the evil house of Ahab and Jezebel. And yet, a man brimming with self-confidence and human ability, and somewhat short on humility, true spirituality, true desire to honor God, true desire to obey God in everything that he did. May God help us to look and learn. Okay, why are we doing what we're doing? What are we trusting? Are we trusting our own abilities, or do we have confidence in God? Do we seek spiritual counsel, or we think that we know it all, and with our shrewdness, we can get everything done? Is that the attitude that we have? That is a lesson that we learn from the life of Jehu. May God bless.